Hello, I'm David J. Bauman, and this is In Three Poems, the podcast where poets and poems talk among themselves. This is Season 2, Episode 3. Today we're talking to Crystal Simone Smith, who has come out with a recent book of poetry called Common Sense, addressed to today's citizens of America, and Erasure. Welcome to the podcast, Crystal. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let me ask you, maybe some of our listeners don't have as much familiarity with erasure poetry or blackout poetry. I'm sure it's been being done for much, much longer than people know. What would you say maybe brings you to the erasure form of poetry versus, say, some of the works you've done before focus a lot on Japanese forms of haiku and tanka? What drew you to erasure?
Well, I started out as a free verse poet, and I was very drawn to free verse. You're probably going to ask me about a poet that I'm very much inspired by, and that would be Lucille Clifton. And so when I started writing poetry, I wasn't really well read. I had this sort of ability to just sort of express myself and be lyrical and write poetry, but I wasn't well read and well versed on poetry at all. And so Lucille Clifton was very accessible, right? And she sort of spoke to me in a way that, she's talking about trauma. She's using poetry as a tool, as a vehicle, right? To sort of put some of that baggage down. And that's what I was drawn to. So I was a free verse poet. I was also, prior to being a poet, an art major. So my undergraduate degree is in studio art, visual collage. Yeah. And so that, for me, that wasn't too much of a leap, right? To move from, linear free verse poetry to visual poetry, which is really what it is, right?
Right.
That is blackout and erasure. So it wasn't that much of a leap for me, but yeah, I think I'm pretty versatile in that. So, and I like to move in and out of forms. I like to weave in forms. So once I've written enough free verse and I feel like that particular genre has served me well, or that form has served me well, then I move on to something else. And I was introduced to haiku and Japanese forms by Leonard D. Moore, who is a prolific African-American figure in terms of those genres. And I was introduced to it, loved it, dived head first into it, immersed myself, did the daily practice, all the things that you need to do to sort of hone in on that genre and sort of master it. That's what we would call it, of course, in Japanese forms. How do you master this?
Master it.
And so,
that got competitive back in the day.
Oh yeah, big time. Right. And so moved to that, and then I was, well, what about moving further into different subgenres or forms? And it just so happened that it was COVID, and people were taking to the internet because you couldn't go anywhere. You were all isolated, and so people were taking to social media with blacking out text and using erasure, not really knowing. I think it was by happenstance. They didn't know what they were doing, but they saw the brevity. They saw that you could quickly say something, prolific or profound, and just, get an immediate reaction. And so I liked that, and that's when I started to play around with blackout. Blackout poetry is something that I think, like you said, it's a sort of precursor or pre-writing, right? You say, hey, let's play around with this. Let's do something with this. We as poets often use it when we have writer's block. And so you're like, I can't really write linear, so I'm just going to black out something and create a new narrative, and then that'll be the point. And I was playing around with that, and I really immersed in it. And I think that that's the key to the success with anything, but particularly writing, is just the immersion. And once I did that, obviously that rendered Dark Testament. And after that, I went back to blackout a little bit, tried to do a couple of different projects with blackout, and erasure was just the next sort of step, right? It was a natural progression. And I said, well, I've done this, so let's move into erasure. And that's how Common Sense came about.
And what I love about the Erasure as compared to, I think the poem Oscar Grant was from the book that you just mentioned, right?
Dark Testament.
From Dark Testament. And I think I read that one on the Poetry Foundation website, and it was in Poetry Magazine. But with that one, you don't see the source material because it is blacked out. And so that has a different effect. And part of that might be wondering, well, what is the source material? And do I need to know that? Or, because there are multiple meanings. I think you can read that from multiple points of view, from perhaps the police officer's point of view, with the victim's point of view. And it may depend on what baggage you bring to it. Was that something that you intended, that people would read that differently depending on whose eyes were on the work at the time?
I don't know if intention was the process at all, particularly when it comes to audience. I was writing for me. I was using that text to express what I wanted to. And the beauty about erasure or blackout, any visual form, is that you can take a text that exists and you can create whatever you want. So the passage that Mr. Grant came from, which is from Lincoln and the Bardo, written by George Saunders, it's a wonderful book and historical fiction, experimental.
Mm-hmm.
But you could take that passage and I could give it to you or anyone else, and it would be an entirely different poem.
Yeah.
So that's the beauty of visual poetry, is that you have an existing text and you bring you to that text.
Right.
And or whatever's happening with you, or whatever you want to express at the time. And so yeah, that's
and that's with Erasure. This is written with sort of a strikeout kind of font, so that the original text is there, but with it being struck out, and then the words left on the page arise up out of the text. So you get to see how it was originally written and get a grasp a little bit of how it became what it is, and what the writer, in this case Crystal Simone Smith, is doing as she pulls the text up out of it. And instead of saying more about it, maybe I should just jump in and read the first the first piece. And it's called Induction, but of course it's from Thomas Paine's introduction to his pamphlet Common Sense, as he's basically trying to convince American colonists to join the revolutionary cause. And so the TRO is crossed out, and it's instead of introduction, it's induction. Perhaps a long habit of not thinking a thing wrong gives it a superficial appearance of being right. A long and violent abuse of power. It matters, too, the good people of this country are grievously oppressed. Individuals worthy of not local, but universal lovers, and the natural rights of all mankind, to whom the doctrine of independence is now presumed. A performance for the public, a production that is unconnected with any sort of reason and principle. Wow. When you can look at what the original words are there and how you subvert it by erasing some of those words, it's actually delightful to read. You get the multiple meanings going on with it. What drew you to making this about Thomas Paine's writing?
Yes, absolutely. So, and I'm going to try to be brief about this, because I feel like I continually tell this story.
Oh, okay.
But I was teaching a lit course at some point, American lit course, and I thought about where to start. When you're designing a curriculum, you say, where to start? You can start here, you can start with Walt Whitman, you can start wherever you want. And the big sort of anthology that I had of American Lit started with those foundational documents. So most of our early American writing is political writing. It's the foundational documents, because obviously they were trying to establish a nation. And wonderful writing. Thomas Paine was a brilliant writer. Thomas Jefferson was a very prolific writer. And they needed to be. They really needed to be, in order to convince the inhabitants to seek independence. So I thought, this is interesting. Let's include this in the curriculum. And so I included Thomas Paine as a reading in that curriculum, his pamphlet Common Sense. As I started to read it, I had to sort of think about, okay, how does this look today to students
Yeah.
today, to the inhabitants, the citizens today? We're no longer inhabitants, the citizens of today.
Right. Yeah.
It was interesting because I had to think about how much transference has happened from then to now, right? We wanted no monarchy. We wanted freedom and independence and liberty and all of that.
Mm.
But at the same time, if we can look over the last 250 years, that has all been very hard fought for.
Mm.
It's like the freedom from the king of Britain, that's all been very hard fought.
Mm.
And so you think about it and you say, okay, well, what is this idea of equality and independence and all people are created equal? And this sort of, it's theology, it's whatever you want to call it, that's being, sold to us. But at the same time, there's this understanding, underlying, quiet understanding that oppression is continually happening, right?
Right.
The
Right.
oppression that Thomas Paine had so much, he was indignant about it. He was,
Hmm.
we can't have this and we don't want it. That very oppression, he was willing to obviously transfer that to certain groups of people in this country,
Right.
women,
Right.
um, enslaved people, Black people. So, um,
It's like you, at the very best, almost you could say for him, well, you can't, you're fine. You're going to be fine.
yeah,
But what about these other people that, they hate that term privilege, but he doesn't give a thought for the women, poor people, Black people, enslaved people.
indigenous people.
Right.
Yeah. And that's the thing. He is a man of his time, right? I agree with that. He's a man of his time. He understands that white men who are landowners have
Exactly.
this privilege, and that's specifically who he's talking to. The all is not necessarily everyone, right? Because
Right.
everybody is not considered a full citizen or
Right.
a full human, really. So the all is
Hmm.
not everyone. And that's interesting. I should say that Thomas Paine was a Quaker, and he did write essays and, sort of denouncing slavery. I don't think that he necessarily agreed with that, you know, but that's not. I think his goal at that point was to separate the two nations, right?
Yeah.
And the two nations are both ruled by white landowning men, and
Right.
that's specifically who he's talking to. I don't even know if the contradiction resonated with him.
Yeah. 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 And I think it's interesting that you chose induction. I thought, induction is an interesting word because it can be a lot of different meanings there. It could be a ceremonial, sort of like an induction ceremony where we're putting you into this position or this change. It could also be about reason. But there's also this thing that came to mind because I love to cook. And there is this inductive heat, the pan itself, the colonies, what will become the United States, that is creating its own heat that's going to be, as you very rightly said, we've still battled for all these things ever since. No King's rallies or not. You explained a little bit about it. Was there a particular passage in there where the words you wanted to focus on kind of rose up out of the page for you that made you want to go after this as turning the entire document into an erasure?
Right. I don't know that it was a particular passage, and I don't know that the hypocrisy did not start from the very beginning.
Yeah.
uh, in the reading that you just gave. It was almost there from the very beginning.
Yep.
This is a document that is unread by
Hmm.
most people. You're engaging with it now, and we're having a conversation with it now, but it's unread by most people. It was a document of purpose, right? It served
Hmm.
its purpose. It established our nation. But if you go back and you look at it, you go, ah,
Yeah. Yeah.
this is not, or at least whatever the creed is that he's establishing, we are certainly not living up to.
Yeah.
Um, and it certainly was, this sort of isolation of groups of human groups that he was directly speaking to. What I did like more than anything about this document is that it was labeled common sense.
Hmm.
This is a time, if you read the document in its entirety, and you can, because
It's there.
it's all there. It's just what's illuminated is the narrative that I have created, but it's all there for you to read. And this document is well written. I mean, it is just, this ongoing pamphlet of vitriol and, indignation and all of these things, admonishment of this king and all of these things that are happening. Uh, but it's called common sense. And he's talking, like he says, the common people, the common,
Hmm.
right? Archaic, the king's language, all of that is happening. And for me, the term common sense was so interesting because I'm like, how we use that in modern times is, oh, come on.
Yeah. Common
Common
sense
sense.
is not so common,
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is your moral compass. This is what you should think. This is just basic, right? You should have this basic moral compass, and that should just be it, right from wrong, right? And that's how we see it, but that's not how that was viewed back then. And yeah, I think the term common sense really drew me in because he wanted the inhabitants at the time to say, let's think about this in a very simplistic way. Do you
Hmm.
want to live under monarchy or do you not want to live under monarchy? It's going to be sacrificial. We're going to have a war. People are going to die. All of these things are going to happen to form this nation. But common sense says you don't want to live this way. You don't want to live under a monarchy, which, if you think about the parallels of today, is
Yeah.
very interesting.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Um, the irony that he could not predict, right?
Or I don't. I think because the way the nation was established and what was happening, as I say, he's a man of his time. I mean, I don't think that Thomas Paine could predict, even though he
Right.
should have been able to do that, that women would fight for their rights, that
Hmm.
there would be a civil war and enslaved people would be freed, that they would then fight for their rights. That if you put this in a document and say all men are free, everybody's going to expect freedom. Everybody's
Yeah.
going to expect human rights. Everybody's going to say, if you said for all, we assume this is what you
For
meant.
all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that I don't think he could foresee that.
Yeah.
And that was part of the problem.
Liberty and justice for all. Did you mean that or didn't you mean that? So, yeah. So common sense takes on that double meaning as he's thinking about, I suppose, the reasoning, like you said, but now we're looking at through our lens.
Yeah,
Um,
well, he knew and his constituents knew that they did not want monarchy for themselves, that they didn't
mhm.
like it. But
But that doesn't mean that they wanted an uneducated person to vote.
absolutely, absolutely.
And I'm glad we're talking about this book because I do want people to pick it up, and I'll put links down in the show notes, but they can get it from, is it Beacon Press or from Penguin Random House, or from your favorite bookstore easily.
I should say now is a very good time to get it. We are in the centennial. We have a whole year of celebrating 250 years. So
Yes.
if you're interested in the history of this country and this anniversary, it's a really great time to engage with this text.
And so now we're at the 250th. And also just, honestly, politically, everything that is going on, and not just even in our country, right wing changes throughout Europe. It's where Brexit came from.
Absolutely. Not just here in
It's,
America. It's not just here.
oh, yeah. And I love that you had a way of interrogating the text that brought something else up out of it. It was a joy to read. But you chose for your poem something from your next work that's coming out soon. Tell us about that. Or tell us about the next book, or just jump in and read the poem and then tell us about it, whatever
Okay,
you
that,
prefer.
that is a wonderful segue. I will say before I read the poem that what you'll hear is a lot of the subjugation that African Americans in this country experienced, that women in this country experienced over those 250 years.
Hmm.
You'll hear some of that in childhood trauma and all of the things that we experienced. And so yeah, that's a very good segue. So I will read from Ghostwoman Arising, and that is my haiku journey. We call it a haiku journey. It's a practice. It's usually a maybe a daily meditation practice. If you were a practitioner, um,
Yeah.
you maybe write haiku daily. It is one of those things. I should say haiku is deceptively hard to write, and
Mhm.
so we
It's not just 575, and
and
often it isn't even
and
575.
right? It's deceptively hard to do, and so, like, the practice of it makes you obviously better, makes a difference, but, yeah, so this is we call it our haiku journey, so this is 10 years of my writing of haiku and haibun, which is also a Japanese form of prose and haiku together, and so I'm gonna start with a haibun from Ghostwoman, and it's called Loose Ends. When we moved south, my mother was offered the low rate of minimum wage by small business owners still bemoaning the loss of the Civil War. She never masked her disgust, only adjusted her budget. Evenings, when money was down to coinage, she'd hit the convenience store to purchase single cigarettes, one for bedtime, another for morning coffee. When she was killed in a single vehicular accident, I didn't request a police report. I chose to dream up my own ending. In my worst moments, I recalled her penchant to swerve while putting out a butt. When standing above her grave, I've said 1,000 things. 14 years gone like ash. There was literally a black president. Stricter laws placed on smoking. Nowhere in public. And the police have gone entirely rogue. They strangled one man to death for selling singles to folks. After the marathon, mistaking a cloud for a mountain.
Wow. Beautiful. And you sort of foreshadowed that a little bit when you talked about the single cigarettes, because that's the first thing I thought of was him selling cigarettes and that somebody would die for just doing that act. But the idea of buying singles, you know, uh, and partly just because you're forced by your budget to do that, first of all.
And we forget a lot of the nation's wealth was
Yeah.
built on tobacco in this
Oh,
country.
yeah.
And so that's a lot of this nation's wealth, and slavery. So there's
Hmm.
history of smoking in this country. I was an adult when she died. All of this time has passed and you've been gone and all of this has happened, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in her time frame, I would not say at all my mother was a one issue voter. She was not. She was a Democrat and my father was a Republican. He
Oh,
was a
wow.
one issue voter. He was a black Republican, believe it or not. He was a one issue voter because he was military. He was retired
Mm,
military and he cared about pensions and he cared about how Republicans promised to take care of military veterans.
yeah.
She was not a one-issue voter, but she very much cared about smoking, and she
Mm.
wanted smoking to be something that she could do anywhere. She could do it in the store, she could do it in the grocery store, she could do it anywhere she wanted.
Her
Um,
own personal rebellion,
yeah,
perhaps.
that is her personal rebellion, and so she cared about many things, but smoking was a big thing that she cared about. So, when Eric Garner died and that was the cause, I thought so much about her and about her habit of smoking and about just, not even living in this country, working for whatever wage you're working for, and not being able to buy a pack of cigarettes because it's
Yeah.
expensive, right? And so you got to buy one cigarette here and one cigarette there and so much of that came back to me. And so this poem, Loose Ends, sort of encapsulated all of that with linear poetry. And when you're writing free verse or prose, and haibun is a combination of prose and haiku, there is this sort of freedom to really utter things that don't come natural. And I
Yeah.
would say, as a poet, I think my friend Alice, I have a friend who's a writer, and Osborne, and she calls it Windexing, right? Like you're taking something and just completely that may be blurred, that may have smudge on it, and you're bringing out the complete clarity
I
of
love it.
of what's there, and that requires you to go to hard places and utter hard things. Um,
Yeah.
and that's what I have always been drawn to when it comes to writing the line, is the ability to just just say it and spill it, and hopefully it resonates with folks and it's universal and people can take what they can from it.
What is there about that tension between the prose part where you're tempted to be able to, oh, I could explain the haiku part right here.
Yeah, so that is very tricky because I think that people naturally want to, or particularly poets, want to naturally close a poem. That
Yeah.
that is just we want to bring it full circle, right? We want to either leave that door a little open, we want to slam it shut, whatever approach you want to take. You want to close that poem, and people don't understand with Haibun. That's not the goal, right?
Yeah.
The goal is to they need to connect. The haiku and the haibun need to connect in some way, but what you want is you want to create a tension where it
Mm.
shifts away from, but still connects, right?
Yeah.
And that's what happens in haiku. You have 3 lines and you have one line that's doing one thing and the other 2 lines doing something else, and they come together. But the 2 lines coming together with the one line, it's 2 parts to a haiku, create a tension. It creates
Mhm.
a tension, and that is what gives you that moment, that very important aha moment. And so that's also what you're doing with haiku. You want that haiku to somehow connect, but you want it to shift away and create a tension. So when I'm talking the entire time about, my mother and what's happening in the world now and how smoking laws have changed and all of this has changed, and then I go down and my haiku says, after the marathon, mistaking a cloud for a mountain.
Yeah.
That does not talk necessarily about smoking at all, but also you can almost see how it's relational, right?
Yeah.
Because you're really tired, you're not in your best shape after a marathon, and you look up and you may see, oh, but it's actually a cloud,
Yeah.
and there's of course clouds when you're smoking, and so it shifts away but it also connects.
This discussion is inspiring. This is something that I may try now, which
It's
is part of the fun of
fun, you
this.
can try.
You chose a poem by Roberta Beary to read as our third poem. You want to tell us a little bit about that? Or do you want to just read it?
Well, I'll talk just a second about it.
Yeah.
And I will, because this is like another poet, like Lucio Clifton, who I was really influenced by when I first started writing haiku. And it was because she could go to dark places.
Mm.
And that for a long time when I was a student of poetry, or, maybe an MFA candidate, you know why you're writing poetry. You know there's something to uncover. You know there's trauma. You know there's all these things you want to say. But then it's like, how do I say that?
I don't want to say
People will know. People will, judge me. All of these things. And once you give yourself permission, and I have to actually, if I'm honest, I have to credit Claudia Rankin, who was an instructor of mine in an MFA
Oh,
program, who's
what a
like,
wonderful opportunity that must have
it
been.
was, and it was like, you got to go there, you got to go
Yeah.
there, and why are you not going there? So she helped me to get to that place where I could say things that were very uncomfortable. And so when I first encountered Roberta's haiku, which I think she wrote Haibun a little later. She started out very much as a haiku poet. I thought, wow, she's not just seeing the world or the natural world and recording what she's seeing and, giving these sort of responses to it. She's actually invested. She
Mm.
is using this form in one of the most significant ways that you can, in order to combat trauma and to deal with it and to rationalize things that are happening to you that are out of your control. And so I was very drawn to her as well. So that's why I chose this haibun. But I'll go ahead and read it. This is from her collection of haibun called Crazy Bitches. Cry me a river, threading the web, slanted strips of sunlight. The time he asked me for 100 for the rent, the time the bill collector called looking, and I said I have no idea, the time he led his young wife and her kids out of the basement window with suitcases at midnight, the time the landlord rang and said your father seemed so nice, how could he? The time his girlfriend, the one he lived with but didn't marry, said she cured his gambling. The time my mother said she cured his gambling. The time his friends swore your dad doesn't gamble anymore. The time his latest girlfriend said he's so good, he doesn't have any bad habits. And I didn't say anything. Not then, not even when she lost the house. The time he called and I didn't pick up. The time I erased his contact info. The time his buddies from Belmont crowded the casket while the pipes played Danny Boy. And the priest asked for a donation, a few $100s to cover it. And that was the last time. Splitting open the empty nest. Blackbird song.
Mm. And I'm a big fan of birds. So I always love a poem that ends in that.
So magnificent. I love them.
Yeah.
They are the most vulnerable creatures, yet you're not going to touch them because you can't
Yeah.
fly. They have,
right.
have the advantage.
And they don't give, they don't, they can fly. So there's a release there at the end of that piece that isn't necessarily a release from all the dark stuff in the poem, but it's still somehow satisfying.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good stuff.
So I think we both have in common that use of the form or poetry in general to sort of mitigate or deal with trauma.
Yeah.
It's a good use of the form. I think a lot of people use it for that way. I would say for me, it is a tool. I think if you need a therapist, you should certainly seek a therapist. I've seen people misuse poetry in that way.
Yeah.
And it becomes
Where it's not just the vomiting out of everything that's wrong.
Yes. And you become very close to it and attached to it. And for me, as a person who teaches Zen, it's letting go.
Yeah.
Once it's there, you purged it. It's letting go, and then you move on to something else. And for me, I really like engaging in different forms. As you can see, I'm a rangy poet. I move through all different forms, and I really enjoy that because I don't want ego to be a huge part of my process.
Yeah.
And it can become. And maybe we move on to other things. Maybe we write on, I write, about enslaved people or fugitives,
Right.
slaves, and I'm outward with
Yeah.
with my engagement with poetry. That's important.
Well, if you go back to the birding thing, that's in a sense therapeutic. But it would also be therapeutic, I suppose, if I went out there and just screamed at all the birds so that they flew away. but that also is not the purpose. And you could do that with poetry, I suppose.
That is one of my hallmark, more known haiku that I wrote years ago when I was raising my sons. I had little boys, and can I just say the haiku?
Absolutely, sure.
It's spring break, my boys screaming at blue jays. And then I sometimes I tell my students, and they go, "Oh," and they go, "I don't get it." And I go, "You have to understand, if a blue jay, a beautiful blue jay, lights and is in front of you, the last thing you want to do is scream. You want to scream. You want to, but they're little boys, right? They don't care, and that's but yeah. And they got a lot of energy. So, but that's a pretty known haiku of mine.
Well, Crystal, thank you so much for being a guest, and thanks for sharing your poetry and Roberta's poem as well. Like I said, I'll put links in the show notes that people will easily be able to follow. And as we are celebrating, if that's the word, 250 years, commemorating, recognizing. Oh, sorry, I don't mean to be cynical.
There needs to be a recognition, and there needs to be, all of it. We need it all.
Well said.
The truth. We need, the historical account. We need it all.
Yeah, and poetry this is an awesome vehicle to approach it with. Thank you for giving us that opportunity, and thanks for being with me here on In Three Poems.
Thanks so much.
For In Three Poems, I'm David J. Bauman. We've been chatting with Crystal Simone Smith. She and I read from her recent book of Erasure poetry, Common Sense, addressed to today's citizens of America, published by Beacon Press. Crystal also read Loose Ends from her upcoming book, Ghostwoman Arising, due out in November, and you can learn about all of her books on her website at crystalsimonesmith.com. Our third poem was Cry Me a River by Roberta Beary from her 2025 collection of Haibun called Crazy Bitches, published by Macq Books, and we thank Roberta for her kind permission to share the poem on the podcast. In Three Poems, Episode 3 of Season 2 comes your way next week with poet and editor of Whale Road Review, Katie Manning. Listen on your favorite podcast platforms, including Apple, Spotify, even YouTube, just to name a few. And if you like what you hear, give it a like or a share, or better yet, down in the show notes, hit that link that says text the show and send us a text or a voice message. We'd love to hear from you.